One of the reoccurring topics I've been bringing up during my live streams is this idea of how much longer can Nintendo hate continue? Because it feels like to me in the Nintendo Switch era, it's all running off of fumes based on like this weird misconception of what Nintendo is in the 90s. When you look at the big major Nintendo haters out there today, people like, I don't know, Smash JT or like, Grums or like, Raging Golden Eagle, Sean Malmstrom, like these guys are in their 50s. Okay. These guys are old bums and like are completely out of touch with like the reality of the situation in that Nintendo has remained popular after their childhood favorite Nintendo games. Like Mario didn't stop being popular after Mario 3. The brand doesn't revolve around the NES. Nintendo didn't stop being relevant after the N64. What you have essentially is a bunch of people who, in a lot of cases, have not played Nintendo games in decades, making all these weird claims about the company, its games, its fans, and specifically how relevant these games actually are. Because it's shocking, how in the Switch 2 era, how we saw like plenty of very successful games like Bayonetta 3, No More Heroes 3, Splatoon 3, SMT5, just to name a handful. Like Metroid Dread for a long time. It was shocking to me, like seeing how many of these games came out, broke records in a lot of ways, and yet were denounced by the community as being failures or disappointing or not as good as older games. When more experienced players were more into all of them. It's No More Heroes 3, I think, is a pretty good example of this because no More Heroes 2 was a massive step down from the original. So a wild change in direction for 3 was actually very warranted. But, when it actually comes out, you have these people who, by the way, also complain about Travis Strikes Again, turned around and started complaining about that too. It's become kind of a stereotype, honestly. Like looking at the Nintendo hate community online and seeing that a lot of these guys are boycotting Nintendo because they allegedly censored Nintendo games in 10 years ago. Like I still see people seething about Fatal Frame 5, about Tokyo Mirage Sessions, Fire Emblem Fates. Those games are almost 10 years old now. And Nintendo has put out tons of classic games since, including titles like Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which are more sexualized than Fatal Frame ever was. Like there's definitely this weird like double standard when it comes to Nintendo products. Like I've even heard that like Smash JT is implying that the Nintendo short close to you is actually transcoded because there are pink and blue colors in the background. Like that is the most insane thing ever. So you're not supposed to like you can't look at pink and blue colors and like think of anything other than troons, right? Like that's kind of like these guys are just warped. They're twisted beyond belief. They have no conception of what Nintendo actually is and it are just like endlessly clickbaiting about the company and constantly trying to gaslight you into thinking Nintendo fell off a long time ago and that they're a shell of their former selves. And the Switch 2 launch period is a really good like emphasis on that because we've seen Mario Kart World come out, be successful, sell Switch 2s, and yet we saw a lot of people come out and try to say Sonic Racing Cross Worlds was going to be better. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. It failed. And then we had Bonanza, which was great. Everybody loved it. It was super hype. And then somehow, some way, the DLC campaign was overpriced because it was being sold at $20. Now, I played the Bonanza DLC. Not only is it better than the base game, it takes dozens and dozens and dozens of hours to master. Like if you really get into Emerald Rush, like I have, I honestly prefer Emerald Rush to the base game at this point. Like I have had so much more fun with Emerald Rush than I ever did with the base game of Bonanza, and yet I'm not really hearing a lot of praise for that. People tried complaining about the price point. Pokemon Legends ZA is coming out next week. Probably one of the year's biggest games, and yet, you saw people make a controversy out of Nintendo announcing DLC before launch day, as if that's like some strange taboo thing. When we've had this happen before. This is not some anomaly thing. I think Age of Calamity had one too, if I remember correctly. But anyway, it's not some completely out of left nowhere thing. And the common cope that people had about it is that they were going to sell the ending to you again. No, like on day one, no. Like the story expansion is not coming out until February. The end of the month. So 4 months of the base game, then the DLC expansion is coming out. Like you can just buy it now for a couple of megas and some costumes if you want. So basically, the entire narrative that we've seen in regards to Switch 2, the idea that it's been a failure and that there's nothing to play, has completely fallen off. Like, there isn't a single thing I believe has really established itself in the mainstream when it comes to Switch 2, especially that narrative early on that third-party games weren't selling on the platform. As of today, I believe Street Fighter 6 is actually my most played game on Switch 2. I've put 50 hours into it. I have put more time into it than Mario Kart World at this point. So, Hitman and World of Assassination isn't far behind. So, when you take that into consideration, when you take that, when you realize that, when you learn more about these games and how much is coming out, Kirby Air Riders is going to outperform Sonic Cross Worlds. Like, how exactly is coping and seething from these boomers going to survive? Because one of the things I've noticed on this channel is the severe uptick in viewership. Severe. Like, my numbers have jumped more over the past couple of weeks than they have in my entire channel's my entire channel's existence. And I think the reason for that is because the masses are just tired of people who don't play Nintendo games endlessly accusing them of doing things that they simply didn't do. Of accusing every single game of being a failure or disappointing or not making any sense. People are sick of Darkside Phil screaming at Mario Kart World for not having enough content when, I can come on, stream the game whenever I want and have a blast, and I will probably until the next one comes out, assuming I live that long. So with all that being said, why exactly the Nintendo Switch 2 is in this really interesting situation where this is clearly an overwhelmingly successful platform. The Switch 1 is still very much relevant. This thing is still doing very well. I'm happy with it. People are enjoying it. Third-party games are doing well. There's a lot to look forward to. And yet, we're still in this early period where everybody is just kind of plugging their ears and insisting that, PC gaming is going to destroy Nintendo somehow. And I really can't emphasize enough just how off base that mindset actually is. If Nintendo, what could Nintendo do to bring these people back? Is my genuine mindset. And I really don't think it's possible. These guys, considering their careers, their backgrounds, their development histories, the companies they've started, the YouTube channels they run, hating Nintendo is an instrumental part of their brand. We are seeing in real time how so many game journos in the 90s and 2000s established their long-standing hatred of Nintendo. I grew up in that period where people were trying to gaslight you into thinking that Jack and Daxter and Tack and the Power of Juju were somehow better than Mario Sunshine. That was a real thing that people were pushing at the time, that games are becoming more story centric and that's going to lead to higher quality products. And what happens instead is that the games just become derivative. They become uninspired, and like we've seen with Ghost of Yotoi, they kind of just become the same plot over and over and over again. The narrative that was established in the 2000s, when I was younger, has completely imploded. And I'm very curious at seeing at what point this Nintendo hate, this established corporate, money-driven mindset, how long can this survive realistically? How much longer can people keep pretending Nintendo just isn't good anymore when they are the only video game developer that has survived the video game crash. Not the 80s one in which they saved the North American video game market, the biggest market in the world at the time, but the new one, the video game crash part 2, like the return of ET, in which, all of these established video game companies, all these brands, they have become so ludicrously expensive, their budget's so out of control, and the consumer base has shrunken so much that they simply can't keep the lights on, no matter how much they try and gaslight people into thinking their games are relevant or important. That is what we're seeing here, is that the Switch 2 is a really interesting change of is a very interesting platform in the sense where it is continuing the legacy of the Switch at an affordable price with the Switch's pre-existing backlog of games. And I think a lot of people more often are going to like go back through this library and play all of the great games they've missed over the years. I myself have finally like gone back and played Tales of Symphonia for the first time. I finished Chibi Robo recently. I'm really looking forward to the eventual release of like Pokemon XD and Coliseum. There are new games I'm looking forward to, but at the same time, I'm also on the hunt for Switch 1 games or earlier that I missed out on back in the day. That mindset, I think, is going to become more prevalent in the modern market. People are not excited for the big new AAA games anymore. There's a lot of reasons for that, like the poor visuals, the poor storytelling, the poor mechanics, the lack of real content. But like I think most critically, they're just not very good games. So more and more people are going to discover more niche, great Nintendo games on Nintendo Switch 2, and they are going to explode and become popular. The more Nintendo expands their niche brands, the harder it is going to be for people like Grums to try and gaslight you that Nintendo only produces Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon. Nintendo Switch 2 has already dominated this gaming generation, but at this stage, the industry at large cannot admit it because it completely goes against their grift.